everyone. Welcome. I know you guys are so excited for this afternoon. You are in for a treat. All right, so let's listen very carefully. There are some pictures you can watch on the slides as Mr. Bernie is talking, but also please give him all of your respect and attention while he's speaking. So I'm going to read you a little bit about who our special guest is today. Bernard or Bernie Rosner was born in 1932 in rural Hungary. His early life was shaped by the rigor and discipline of an Orthodox Jewish upbringing and a literate and sensitive mother. Overwhelmed by the Holocaust at the age of 12, he was the only member of his family to survive the gas chambers of Auschwitz and the other horrors of the Nazi concentration camps. Bernie came to the United States in 1948 at the age of 16 and received his education at Cornell University and Harvard Law School. He spent his 35 years career in the legal department of the Safeway supermarket chain, the last 10 as the company's chief legal advisor, or officer. After his retirement in 1994, he and his friend Fritz Tubach co-wrote a book, An Uncommon Friendship, right here, which tells the unique story of two boys trapped on opposite sides of the Holocaust. So let's give him our attention and welcome Mr. Bernie.
Can you hear me all right? Yes. Good, good. Well, first of all, I want to thank the staff of the Thompson Station Middle School for inviting me. Thank you guys to attend and listen to what I have to say, and hopefully, if you should have any questions, there will be time that I can answer at least some of them. It's always a special occasion for me to be able to talk to young people. It's special for at least 3 reasons. First, you have to remember that when I landed on the train platform at the Auschwitz concentration camp and went through the nightmare of the Holocaust, I was just 12 years old, probably several years younger than you are now. For that reason, I feel that young people like you can relate more strongly so to what I went through, and hopefully you can also draw some inspiration and support from my story when you face crises and problems that at the time they hit you, they seem overwhelming. Second, I was among the youngest persons to survive the Holocaust. And earlier this year, I observed my 92nd birthday. The obvious conclusion is that there are few living survivors left. This makes it, in my mind, a special occasion for both you and me. It's not very likely that too many students in the future will have a chance to hear the story of what happened during those terrible times from a person who actually lived through those events. I believe that that's something special, because it makes a big difference between reading something in the books and hearing the story from the mouth of one who actually lived through it. Third, you are the future. It will be up to you to hopefully make the world a better place and to do your best to make sure that the horrors of the Holocaust and the other acts of inhumanity and terror that we have unfortunately witnessed since then do not just keep repeating themselves. Before going any further, I want to give you a little history and background so that you can better understand my story. First, my story is basically about anti-Semitism. That means hatred of Jewish people. It is a form of racism where some people hate other people because of their race. About 80 years ago, when I was 10 years old, a man by the name of Adolf Hitler became the leader of Germany. He was a brutal and vicious anti-Semite. He hated Jews and wanted all Jews to be slaves or killed. The people who followed and supported Hitler and his racist ideology were called Nazis. To carry out his plans, Hitler ordered all Jews in Germany and in the many other countries that Germany occupied during World War II to be put in prisons called concentration camps, to be either slave workers or murdered if they were not fit to work. It is estimated that over 6 million Jews were murdered by Hitler's orders, and other ethnic groups were treated likewise because he wanted a master race. This destruction of the Jewish people became known as the Holocaust. Because my family was Jewish, we were all sent to a concentration camp, and I was the only member of my family to survive. The name of the first concentration camp where my family and I were taken and where the rest of my family was murdered was called Auschwitz. For many years after the war, after coming to America, I put the memories of the war and my experiences in the concentration camps out of my mind. Then, about 30 years ago, I attended the opening and dedication of the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1992. While there, I was given access to the records kept by the museum, including the log of prisoners entering the Mauthausen concentration camp. As I stared at the records, there was the following entry for September 19, 1944. Bernard Rosner, prisoner number 103 705, 103 705. As I looked at that banal, bureaucratic notation, the floodgate of memory and emotion opened and overwhelmed me. In that regard, you must remember that there is not a picture, document, or any tangible thing that connects me to my former life. The upshot of this experience was a decision to tell my story. I did this in a book with the title of An Uncommon Friendship, which has been also translated into German, Italian, and Dutch. The rest of what I have to say will consist mainly of telling you something about myself, where I came from, what I went through, and how I ended up where I did. I was born in a Somalish town by the name of Tub in rural Hungary. For the first 12 years of my life, I had a basically normal and happy childhood. It wasn't the kind of childhood you had. There was one car in the town, and at least one street was paved. Most people had outdoor sanitation, but I didn't miss all the luxuries that now we take for granted. An important part of my personality and makeup was shaped by the rigor and discipline of an Orthodox Jewish upbringing and a sensitive and literate mother. Both influences imbued me with an abiding love and respect for books and learning. Anti-Semitism was certainly not unknown in Hungary, and it existed in a good measure in our village going back as far as I can remember. It was institutional in terms of laws that restricted the freedom of Jews from practicing certain professions or owning land, and limiting the number of Jews who could be admitted to law, medical, journalism, and other professional schools. It was also personal in terms of Jews being bullied and held up to contempt and hostility, not by any means by all of the non-Jewish population, but by a substantial segment, many of whom were members or followers of the Hungarian version of the Nazi and other racist parties. But this was not the virulent and deadly doctrine of extermination as preached and practiced by Hitler and his thugs, and the anti-Semitic undercurrent running through Hungarian political and cultural life did not significantly affect our everyday life and my basically happy and tranquil childhood. All this changed with a dramatic suddenness on a very specific day, March 19, 1944, relatively late in the course of World War II. I remember the day very well. I was on my way home from school when a neighbor woman asked me if I had heard the news. When I asked what news, she told me that the Germans had taken over the country and the government. The effect of the Nazi takeover on the Jews of Hungary were immediate and disastrous. I will limit my account to what happened to me, to my family, and to the Jewish community of Tub. Within days following the takeover, the stream of anti-Jewish edicts began. Jews could not travel without specific permission. Soon they could not travel at all. Prominent families in the community, as well as those suspected of subversive activities or associations, began to disappear. By mid-April, all Jews had to wear a prominent yellow star on their outer clothing. I remember the evening before the edict went into effect, my mother and we sitting in our living room, and she was sewing the yellow stars on our jackets and sweaters. By mid-April, all Jews had to wear a prominent yellow star. By mid-May, all Jews were herded into a ghetto. My family was lucky in this respect. Our home was within the area that was designated as part of the ghetto. But our 3-room home, instead of just housing my immediate family, also became home for numerous relatives, as I recall, between 16 to 18 in all, whose homes were outside the ghetto boundaries. The end of the Jewish community in Tub came during the latter part of June 1944. On 24 hours' notice, we were ordered to be ready for departure in front of our homes with no more than one suitcase per person. 3 images stand out for me from the day on which we were marched down the main street of Tub to the unused brickyard next to the railroad station. The first was the attitude and behavior of the non-Jewish inhabitants. A relatively small number of them stood on the sidewalks as well as we were being herded by, and made jeering comments like, "You Jews are finally getting what's coming to you." The great majority of the town people simply retreated into their homes, closed their shutters to block out the sight of their fellow citizens being driven down the street like cattle. The second remembrance was at the local school of all places on the way to the railroad station, where I witnessed my mother's humiliation at being stripped naked in a crowded room and hand-searched by Nazi thugs. The third remembrance was at the brickyard, with only a bare earthen floor for accommodations, where an elderly woman, standing up to recite her Sabbath prayers, was clubbed bloody and unconscious by one of the guards. Now, much more and more terrible things happened later, but you got to imagine that somebody who lived just a normal life suddenly being steeped into this kind of a nightmare. From Tub, we were shipped to a collection point about 30 miles away, where we were unloaded onto a large open field. There, we were joined by approximately 7,000 to 10,000 others collected from other ghettos that were that part of Hungary. And from there, during the week of July of 1944, we were loaded into freight cars, between 50 to 60 men, women, and children per car, headed for Auschwitz. We arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on approximately July 7. I remember it was a Friday. By the time the sliding door of the freight car, which remained locked, mostly locked throughout the 5-day journey, was opened, there were at least a half dozen corpses or near corpses, and Mary Moore, whose minds became unhinged. On the train platform at Auschwitz, there was chaos, brutality, and confusion. But my immediate family, my mother, my father, and my younger brother, were still together. The first thing that happened, as we stood there dazed, was an order on the loudspeaker that those in charge of each cattle car, and my father was so designated, were to report to the authorities. So my father left us, and that was the last time we saw him. Next, an announcement was made that males and females should separate because showers would be given. By this time, my mother was quite frightened and told my brother and me to stay with her. I told her that I was not about to take a shower with a bunch of women. She didn't argue with me, but left me with the admonition, whatever you do, make sure you stay with your brother. With those words, she left us, and I never saw her again. Next, all the males were ordered to line up in a single file to be inspected by 2 Germans, officers. The officers looked at each person as he reached the head of the line, and those who looked able-bodied and fit to work were sent to the right. Those who looked too young or too old or otherwise unfit for work were sent to the left. My brother, who was just over 10, was in front of me in the line, and the SS officer, without hesitation, sent him to the left. Harking back to my mother's admonition, and without realizing the consequences of my action, I followed my brother to the left. I was about 2 steps past the Nazi when he reached over, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, and shoved me over to the right. To this day, I do not know whether the Nazi thought that I just might be fit and old enough to be able to put to work, or whether he was simply irritated at my having made my own decision. In any case, that shove from the left to the right made the difference on that day between my ending up in the gas chamber within the hour, as did the rest of my family, or my surviving at least that initial screening process. My ordeal obviously did not end with that fateful shove. Every day for the next 10 months, until my liberation by the Americans during the first week of May 1945, was a battle of survival. The battle took several forms. At first in Auschwitz, it was a matter of trying to avoid being sent to the gas chambers. This was so because even though I survived the initial screening, I kept flunking the physicals that the prisoners were subjected to in order to qualify for permanent work assignment. By the way, often asked whether I have the tattoos from Auschwitz on my arm. And I do not have them because there was such a flood of victims coming in at that time that you didn't get a number until you were processed and assigned to a work assignment and moved out from what was called the quarantine, euphemistically called a quarantine lager or camp. By mid-September of 1944, I realized that most of those remaining in my barracks consisted of the old, the sick, and those like me too young to be selected for work. At that point, in a desperate move that is described in the book, I managed to get into a transport out of Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. From then on, my battle for survival was mostly a matter of fighting and trying to survive hunger, cold, brutal beatings, overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and just about every other privation known to man. To illustrate, let me give you a brief picture of a typical day at the Mauthausen concentration camp. I will start with the bedtime in the evening. Our sleeping accommodations were triple-decker bunk beds. But instead of one person per bed, we were squeezed 3, sometimes 4 persons per bed. The result was horrible overcrowding, with people fighting with each other for every inch of available space. There was no mattress on the bed, sometimes some filthy ground-up straw, often just wooden boards. One night, I offered a deal to my bunkmates. If they let me have the single blanket we were allotted, I would go down and sleep on the floor under the bed and free up some space on the bed. My offer was accepted, and that was a win-win situation in Mauthausen. We were woken up about 6:30 in the morning, mostly with shouts, but if the overseers thought we were not quite quick enough, then with clubs. Our barracks, housing about 100 men, had 2 faucets and 1 3-hole latrine for our sanitation needs. By 7, we had to be outside the barracks and line up for roll call. We had to stand and wait for the German officer to show up to receive the roll call report from the barracks chief. Sometimes the German would not show up for an hour or more, and we had to stand there in rain or snow or bitter cold until he showed up and received the report. This was during the fall and winter months, and we only had these striped prisoner uniforms for clothing. After roll call, we had breakfast, which consisted of a brown, lukewarm liquid that they called coffee. After breakfast, the able-bodied prisoners were sent out to work on work details, including one assignment that gave Mauthausen merited the name of a death camp because it was a stone quarry several hundred feet deep, and prisoners were supposed to pick up rocks and go up on makeshift steps. And one of the amusement of the German soldiers and the overseers was to push people over backwards while they were carrying their rocks. And for a reason that I don't understand, the prisoner wouldn't let go of the rock, and he tumbled back down on the stairs and either lost his life or was badly injured. Because of my age and situation and some degree of humanity left, I was sent to the quarry just once. The rest of my work in Mauthausen was working in the kitchen peeling potatoes. When you were not picked to work, all of us who were not picked for work had to stay outside the often freezing cold. To ease our discomfort, we huddled against each other for body heat. One amusement of the more brutal overseer guards was to start beating the outer layer of this huddled mass with clubs and watch the whole group break into a stampede. In the course of one of these stampedes, my feet got trampled on, resulting in cold sores that never healed during my time in the camps, and I still have the scars on my feet. For lunch, we were served a cup of greasy liquid called soup, made out of dried beets. And I hope I won't spoil your appetite for dinner, some dead maggots floating in the liquid. Our dinner consisted of a slice of bread with a square of margarine or a scoop of jam. During my 10 months of imprisonment, I never had a glass of milk or a piece of fruit. The only exception was one day when we were carrying airplane parts on a public street, and a civilian woman was walking ahead of us eating an apple. Weren't you eating an apple when we came down this hallway?
No, but Mr. Loudon was.
Whoever it was, I had this flashback.
Yeah.
She didn't throw me the apple to
No.
eat. She looked around furtively to see that there were any guards looking, and then threw the half-eaten apple on the ground. I was the lucky one who picked up the apple, took a bite, and then shared the spoils with my best friend. To add to our misery, the unsanitary conditions resulted in an enormous infestation of lice. We spent much of our days squirming and scratching, and our evenings trying to kill the vermin that were crawling in our clothing. A very large number of prisoners contracted typhus as a result of the lice, and many of them died of the disease. I too got sick, but fortunately the symptoms did not show up until after I was liberated by the Americans in early May 1945, and I was cared for and recovered in an American field hospital. When I woke up after several days of lying unconscious, I was put on a scale, and at the age of 13, I weighed 26 kilos, or about 52 pounds. Following the war, there were many pictures in magazines and newsreels showing the cadavers-like people, creatures that emerged from the concentration camps upon liberation by the Allies. I was one of them. With all the brutality and deprivation, there were instances of humanity and selflessness, sometimes from unexpected sources. Let me give you 2 examples. The first involved a German soldier who was one of the guards when we were being moved from the Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camps. The journey was by train and freight cars, but the conditions were not nearly as terrible as those that I described on the trip from Hungary to the Auschwitz. There were about 30 male prisoners per car. We had adequate sanitation and water and meager but regular meals. The guard with his rifle was quartered with us in the freight car. During the first day of the 3-day journey, he was distant and unfriendly. But by the second day, he unbent a little and for some reason took a liking to me. By that evening, he offered me some morsels from his dinner, which was obviously far superior to what we prisoners had to eat. Later that evening, he asked me to sing some songs that I remembered from my home and childhood. I felt that somehow in that cattle car taking me to the next concentration camp, this German soldier and I had formed some sort of a bond. The second instance of some light in the dark days of my captivity involved my best friend and me. You could not possibly survive the physical and emotional trauma of the camps without a buddy system, a friend to lean on, to give support to, and to receive support from. In my case, I found a boy about my age in Mauthausen, the second camp I was in. And we both felt that we made a good fit. There is one of the pictures is of, the name of the boy is Simcha. This is, by the way, my co-author, the German co-author. This is the railroad station in town. That's the log of prisoners. Oh, those are the ruined steps to the synagogue that was destroyed. This is when, after liberation, where we were outfitted with breeches, which was pretty common back then. Here's a picture of some of my. This is in that orphanage, I'd say about 6 weeks after liberation. And this is the school, or this is when the orphanage was together. I can always tell myself, because my ears jutted out, I had terrible jug ears. This is the GI, well, that's going to come later, and I'll explain that. The name of this boy that I made friends with and became buddy with was Simcha, and there is a picture of the two of us in the book. One night, in the middle of the night, someone stole Simcha's shoes while we were sleeping. The shoes were not much. They were basically flip-flops with wooden soles, but they were all we had, and they were certainly better than nothing. So the following morning, Simcha had to walk barefoot through the snow and ice to the factory where we were working, about a mile away. While at work, the thief, another bigger boy, came up to us and said to Simcha, "Guess what? I found your shoes, and if you give me your day's ration of bread, you can have your shoes back." Simcha and I knew that he could not possibly survive without his shoes, and knew that neither could he survive without his ration of bread. The only solution was to try to make it for the day with one ration for the two of us, and to use the other ration to buy back his shoes. We did this without discussion or question. We both took it for granted that he would do the same for me if it was necessary. People ask me if there were any good days in the camps. I tell them yes. It was the day when I saved my best friend's life with half a slice of bread. A word about our liberation. It happened on May 5, 1945, a couple of days before the end of the war in Europe. We were in a makeshift camp in a forest as we were being driven on foot ahead of the advancing Americans. For days before, we were hearing increasing loud artillery explosions that shook the ground. To add to our misery, the weather was terrible, and we were mired in freezing mud, both outside and inside our leaky and drafty barracks. About the middle of the afternoon, on that day, a prisoner rushed in the barracks and yelled, "Hey, the guards are gone." That was the way we found out that we were liberated. What did we do then? Did we do a victory lap and celebrate? The answer is no. Instead, we rushed to the warehouse that stored the maggot-ridden ingredients of our daily soup, ripped open the sacks, and crammed mouthfuls of this noxious stuff into our mouths. I spent my first night of freedom lying on one of the sacks, trying to ignore the lice that were feasting on my flesh and hoping to get some sleep. Very briefly, I will tell you how I ended up where I am and how a chance encounter in the summer of 1945 changed and gave a new direction to my life. By that time, with the war in Europe over, I was in a refugee camp in Italy, in the town of Modena. I was alone, just over 13 years old, ragged and hungry. There were tens of thousands of kids like me hustling for an extra piece of bread or chewing gum. The only source of these goodies was the American soldiers who were stationed near our camp. So naturally, I spent much of my time hanging out near where the Americans were billeted. As I was standing there one day, looking for a hustling opportunity, a jeep drove up loaded with 4 GIs and their duffel bags. I immediately ran up to the jeep, headed for the nearest soldier, and with sign language offered my services as a porter. He smiled and pointed at the bag. Later, my employer told me that all he could see was the bag and my 2 bare feet underneath, pumping away with great energy. After I delivered the bag to his room, the soldier gave me a chocolate bar, which was the basic objective of the whole exercise, and we attempted to make conversation. We discovered that our only way of doing so was broken German. I told him about my situation, and he was visibly moved. For the next 5 days, he spent all of his free time with me, taking me to the movies and restaurants, treats I've never had before. We also did a lot of walking and talking. There's a picture of the book, in the book, about the two of us taken by a street photographer. 5 days after I met him, the soldier was transferred, but we started corresponding with each other. The upshot of this encounter was that after the soldier returned to the U.S. and was demobilized, he wrote me a letter offering to bring me to the U.S. and to have me become part of his family. I gratefully accepted his offer, and in January of 1948, I arrived in the United States at the age of 16 to begin my new life. Some people complain that the change from Europe and European habits was upsetting and disconcerting. To me, it was like I died and went to heaven. When I first embarked on this project to tell my story, my intention was not to send a moral message. My intention was to discharge some debts. First and foremost, I had an obligation to my children. As they grew up, they heard bits and pieces of the story, but never in a coherent and systematic way. More importantly, I subconsciously kept the pain and emotion out of whatever I told them. I realize now that this was not as much to protect them as to protect me. I also owed an obligation to the family I lost. My mother, my father, my kid brother, and my extended family. The story of the Holocaust, how the millions have been murdered, has been told many times. But their own story has never been told. I felt that they deserved that be done, and that it was up to me to do it. I also felt that my story was a good and fascinating yarn that was worth telling. With all the horrors and suffering, there were moments of tension, suspense, and adventure. The old truism that often the truth is stranger than fiction is, I believe, applicable to several aspects of my story. But even though the story was not told to send a moral message, I believe that it does so nevertheless, and it does so at several levels. The most important is the need to avoid hatred, bigotry, and intolerance, and to speak out against these destructive tendencies. Finally, my story carries the message of the resilience of the human spirit and a hope for a better world. Thank you.